Hi to everyone who's watching. My name is Olivera Jonkic. I'm the translator of the book Past: An Introduction to the Problem, authored by a collective headed by Boris Budin, kuda.org from Novi Sad, and Mama from Zagreb. And the book just recently appeared in its European edition, maybe a couple of weeks ago. And it's slated to appear in the United States within the next month, so by the end of June, from Iskra Books. And we are here to have a conversation, myself and Alexander Bošković, who is a scholar of experimental and avant-garde art practices. And he looks at those practices through the lenses of comparative media studies. And we're here to speak about the book because Alexander has been involved in the various elements this book discusses or touches on for years or through a variety of scholarly and pedagogical endeavors. I met Alexander at Columbia University last fall. There was a very exciting conference about Želimir Žilnik as an avant-garde artist from former Yugoslavia at Columbia University, where Alexander is teaching. And it was, we just realized at a time when the assault on Gaza was in its, we thought, not entirely early days. And at this point, we are meeting in May of 24. That conflict is still continuing. Columbia University looks different now than it did then. And we met for this conference at the Herman Institute, which is the Institute for International Studies or Relations, or does it have a name?
For Russian, East
right.
European, and Central Asian, yeah.
This, in the context of US higher education, is sort of a fascinating kind of place, especially at an Ivy League institution such as Columbia University, because it's the kind of place that is a monument to so-called area studies. I noticed at the time that the weekend we were there for the conference about Želimir Žilnik, we could see the posters announcing events coming up in the following weeks. One of those events was going to welcome Hillary Clinton and David Miliband, who were going to discuss global politics in that same space. So we are kind of embarking on a conversation about what this book and what Alexander has to say about the way the book and the study of Eastern Central Europe film art, Želimir Žilnik, has to say about the current moment, why these kinds of books might be important for us to have more of. And I'm here as a translator and as a kind of link between the two places and two languages and two sort of reading publics. So,
yeah, thank you, Olivera, for having me here. And first of all, congratulations on the book.
thank you.
I was lucky enough to get a copy, and it looks really good. It's a great design, and it's, as I can see, the extended version of what was existing in the Serbo-Croatian or Bosnian Croatian Serbian language, published earlier, somewhat earlier. It has a new additions to it, and great work for translating it. Congratulations. I think the book will be most likely used in North America's education, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I will maybe say a few words about the conference that we met. So last fall, Želimir Žilnik, with the help of Greg de Cour, was in North America on a tour. He visited many universities on both Pacific coast and Atlantic coast. So at Columbia, we hosted a conference that was one in the line. I think it came immediately after he visited Ohio and Cambridge and preceded his visit to Harvard and Boston. And this conference was just a part of a much a richer presence of Želimir Žilnik in New York. Namely, there was a retrospective of his films at the Anthology Film Archives that was also accompanied by the event at Eflux, where audience, much younger and different audience, had a chance to see the films, short films, and also interview that Želimir Žilnik had with film scholar and professor Pavla Levi. At Columbia, we had a more of an academic event with several participants coming from North American universities, as well as Zagreb and Belgrade, and also Britain. There was a group of scholars who talked about practice and poetics and methods of Žilnik's filmmaking. Some of them were analyzing some specific films, and many of them were talking more in general about the themes and methods of his filmmaking that is very unique. I gave a little bit provocative title as Avantgarde Doesn't Surrender, which I wanted to underline basically the longevity and activity that Žilnik himself represents. So could have been called Želimir Žilnik Does Not Surrender, because he is one of the directors who is very active in filmmaking and also presenting his own works. So yeah, this happened, as you said, in early November last year, and it seems that reverberations of what was happening on a global scale are still felt, especially at Columbia. And from that perspective, it seems that not only Želimir Žilnik's films, but also the book that you edited with translated, that is much more than filmmaking of one of the most important directors from former Yugoslavia, but it is a book also about the Yugoslavia and Yugoslav past and Yugoslav heritage. But it is a book about the ideas that are still important and alive to with which we could critically engaged and actively engaged in the acts of solidarity within our present moment, and critically engage with the whole situation we are now globally in. So yeah, I would maybe like leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you. I was wondering if you could say more about the idea that Želimir Žilnik is sort of an enduring, resilient kind of art maker who also appears in this book as a sort of consistently reliable participant in the political life as an art maker, and also as a kind of witness who we are also told is a kind of witness to history that takes history to be a particular way of thinking about being in the present moment. That the films themselves are a kind of documentation. but also that Žilnik himself is a very articulate thinker, which I think was also clear at the conference, about what his art is doing, and that he's not a conventional theorist of art or a film theorist. And that's one thing that what is put and emphasized in the book, that there's something about sort of amateurism or outsider contributions to political critique and art theory, that is important to take into account. Do you think something we can there's something we can say about that now?
Yeah, definitely. As you said, the position that Žilnik took throughout his career is the position someone who is on the margin, or someone who is always in close relation with those on the margin, someone who is interested in people coming from the margin, people who are unrecognized, people who are political outcasts, or who are on the fringes in economical terms, on the fringes of society. I mean, we have to have in mind also that Žižek, when he made his first film as very young, when he was 27, and he won a big award in Berlin, right, for that film, he was not a professional filmmaker. And I think that position is something that he kept throughout his career, of someone coming literally, to use the pen, right, from the left field, and somebody whose leftist inclinations and thinking are present in not in terms of only ideological sense, but in terms of very, I would say, humanistic foundations. Because even throughout the Yugoslav period, the period of Yugoslavia, he was also critical towards the system for not achieving what the communism as the ideology was promising. He was also very much engaged in researching the relation between the cinema as a tool for social change and outcomes that the art can produce in such an endeavor. And he continued his very specific and peculiar art practice and art method, coming from that experience, very early experience, coming to the conclusions that there are limits to art engagement in politics and social change. And it seems to me that he doesn't stop. He is continuing, and then that resilience is something that probably springs from the very circumstances within which he was born, raised, and lived, but also has to do with the character, right? His own character. And it seems to me that unpretentious take of engaging with reality really bears fruits, and really promises some sort of uncompromised political position that the artist, contemporary artist, can take. Yeah.
Do you think that there's something to be said about how the sort of marginal position or outsider position for the artist and for the subject of his filmmaking explains to a degree how the films survive in relevance and in significance as the kinds of films that clearly were not committed to any sort of overwhelming political agenda or ideological profile, but that Žilnik sort of took it upon himself to figure out his own pathway or to sort of assess to me, one of the sort of fascinating things about the book is how he talks in great detail about the logistics of filmmaking and the conditions of possibility that are made real by the socialist state and then by all these companies that are founded by the socialist state in order to make filmmaking possible. And that something about kind of knowing how a film becomes a film, how it requires a certain number of people and a certain amount of investment financially and otherwise, how that's something that he sort of learned almost by accident, but that remains a guiding value, that he's not waiting for permission to make something that will make sense to people who are sort of the tastemakers, but that he's just making movies under any conditions possible. And then we get to think about, as critics or outsiders or viewers, what can be done.
Yeah, it definitely, the book opens up the entire horizon, not only of how the things were in the former Yugoslavia, but also how he saw these things are. And I think that is very important. By coming from the margin, he did not position himself like, okay, I'm not now going to think about how I'm going to get money to make a film, how I'm going to talk to the producers, etc. But he was more interested in the very problem that he wants to address and examine and problematize and illuminate by the means that he had at his disposal. But of course, he was very aware of these material conditions, as you would say, and institutional conditions that were existing at the time, at the end of the 60s and throughout the 70s before he went to Germany in exile. And he's very much engaged in this book, explaining his own historical experience as a filmmaker, what was allowed, and what were the basically limits that sometimes he had to push in order to save his own integrity. And I think that's maybe for Žilnik, in my opinion, one of the important concepts, that he kept his integrity untainted, right? Unspoiled. And that is something that even in former Yugoslavia was not easy to do, let alone in contemporary moment. But I think that he was approaching film not looking after the aesthetics, right? And thinking about it from the financial side or from the side of the selling of film and market economy. But he was more interested in actually engaging with the social reality and creating, in a way, some sort of experiential wealth through his filmmaking. When I say experiential wealth, it is important to know that it is a shared experience, not only for, having his own experiences and benefiting from them as a filmmaker, but also enabling other people who are featured in his film to somehow reflect on the existential position that they are in, and eventually to see whether there are any ways to change the conditions they are in and to eventually change their own lives for better. And I think putting himself as a filmmaker on a par with people who are featured in his film is something that is very valuable, and maybe we can say also original for Želimir's film practice.
And when it comes to these sort of decisions or projects that come out of the circumstances, and sort of address the circumstances at the same time. We were saying something earlier about how these films and Želimir Žilnik's reflections on how these things were made and sort of whatever one can remember about what was possible. There's something in the book that sort of values, especially this idea about the moment in which we are now. And I guess it's important to say the book was published in its original language, whose names are proliferating as we speak. So Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, we might have more names. But so the book came out 10 or 11 years ago, maybe even 12. And it is coming out to the Anglophone readership in 2024. At the conference at Columbia, I spoke to Žilnik for a minute about the book, and he was concerned that the book is out of date, in part because of what the sort of nationalist situation is in the countries of former Yugoslavia, and how the politics in Serbia especially are sort of beyond the pale of anything he was imagining 10 years ago. And I argued that it's not out of date, that there's something about the scene at which we're looking today that is very much clearly connected, sort of consequence, or just a derivation or a latter day version of what was happening 10 years ago. And that the book puts that situation not just in the context of the disintegration of former Yugoslavia or whatever arguments were being made for ancient hatreds and some sort of ethno-nationalism that's always been there, but that it makes an argument for seeing the conflict in Yugoslavia and the art of Želimir Žilnik as a kind of special trove of information that can be used for understanding how histories of that region, and in particular, the histories of places that are ostensibly post-socialist and newly nationalist, how we can sort of use the work of Želimir Žilnik to place that history, or to see it in a broader context that doesn't make it into sort of freak accident or ancient hatred or collapse of communism and sort of a totalizing narrative. Do you think we could say more about how that works? Especially for you, you are in a Slavic languages department, or Russian and Eastern European studies, or something like that?
Yeah, I think that as you said, it is good to remind us that this book is about Želimir Žilnik, both as a observer, both as mainly as an author of documentary films, although he did make an important feature films as well, but his practice is mainly settled on this specific form of the documentary films that he makes. And he did so to say, continue this practice since the 60s. So he's been present as a voice of an observer and witness of historical experience for quite a while. And he continued throughout this time to record what's going on and to react to all social maladies that kind of flared up in each of these decades since the 60s. His both films and the book that you translated, I think it's valuable for several reasons. First of all, it can be one of the important voices of historical research, which brings the side of the story that has been usually suppressed after the 89 and the demise of communism. Then it is a story that gives a specific view of art practices and art institutions within the former Yugoslavia that usually people from the Western Hemisphere or, North America do not have access to because they are not the insiders nor, share that historical experience. And as you said, as we talked before, Žilnik is a person and the author who did not have inclinations with any of the parties coming out of after the democratic changes, nor he was also involved more specifically with Yugoslav communism after 74 when he was exiled, while before that, of course, he was more communist than the people in power, and he paid a price for that, right? For criticizing the communism, for not being communist enough. So his position again is very, I would say, it is as objective as it could be, to put it that way, if we can have an objective perspective. But it's someone again who kept his integrity as an observer and a critique through the cinematic means of social maladies. And then it is important also to think about the end of socialism and the narratives that came out of after 89 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. As we know, that wall, as if almost fell on the heads of the citizens of former Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia's transition to a new order, neoliberal order, was very bloody and tragic. But there were, I would say, definitely different pathways that were negotiating on the social scene after the wars. One of them was, for example, very much oriented to the market and capitalist production and, free market and democratic constitutions. One of them, like a second one, was very much obsessed with the nationalist discourses, nationalist values, and the narratives that prompted positive response to homoethnic states that came out of the dissolution. And the third narrative, of course, these are all what I'm saying, generalizations, but we can make them now for the sake of conversation. So the third one would be one that is shared by the more leftist-oriented artists who are coming to criticize post-socialist condition of countries in the Balkans, and they are, I would say, maybe the closest ones to what Želimir Žilnik was observing throughout these several decades. And they are definitely involved with some sort of Marxist take or Marxist critique of the conditions we lived actually in the last 20, 30 years. So from that point of view, I think that this book is timely, and that this book is inspiring for someone to think of useful strategies that contemporary thinkers, critical thinkers, and artists could and should use for critically engaging with the reality we live in.
And what is your sense of, since you like me have lived on this side of globalization for a while and in this language, what's your sense of the kind of discourse or language that is available now? And I was kind of hoping the book would contribute to the enrichment of the language in which the history of Yugoslavia and post-socialism can be written or
Narrated,
discussed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of language do you think is now available in English or what kind of thinking is available now for thinking about the collapse of socialism or the end of socialism and sort of the return of sort of extremist economic deprivation?
Yeah, I think we definitely live in time where the conditions of late capitalism are very destructive and limiting in regard to our social freedoms. They are producing the conditions where the social imaginary is proclaimed almost impossible to produce to bear fruits that or to come up with ideas that would be some sort of alternative. However, and despite of all that, I think that the examples that, or the language that this book and other studies that are along the same lines, this book studies of former Yugoslavia that they share is something that is more prone to push forward the narratives of transnational solidarity, the narratives of resistance to the free market, or not free market as such, but resistance to the ongoing and endless commodification of art and the ideas, and also resistance to hegemony of institutional discourses that are also limiting freedoms and pacifying radical voices who would eventually want to address those social ills in proper way. In terms of language, yeah, it does situate this type of language in the historical context from which this language came, and that is, as we know, Cold War, within which Yugoslavia occupied a peculiar position and was on a helm of initiatives, global initiatives such as non-alignment movement, where you didn't only have Americanization of Yugoslav culture and orthodox Marxism, right, in theory and practice, but you also had the presence of the third world. And that kind of triangulation was rare in European or North American countries. And I think Yugoslavia does and should serve as a object of study and a good example in terms of how we should address all these contemporary narratives where we see the global South still being disregarded in favor of the first and second worlds. Yeah, and specifically what is happening now globally in terms of proxy wars and different sort of tragedies that are still perceived among many as far away from us. It is very important to look at the Yugoslav case, how these solidarities were formed, even with people from the global South who were pretty much far away from Yugoslavia. But it meant for Yugoslavs to express solidarity with them and to kind of articulate the politics that was politics that Yugoslavia led on a much more much higher level rather than only through the institutions of art and gallery systems and museums and so forth.
We've been talking for more than 15 minutes. Should we wrap up and
yeah, I mean, this was pretty abstract, but I don't know if you would like to, you know, talk about something more like specific that
yeah, absolutely. Whatever you think we should mention, whatever you think is important to mention in this context or discuss.
Yeah, now like I'm thinking, you know, maybe we can say about, you know, you have in this book, which is really interesting, something that I didn't find in the first edition in the original language. And this is a little glossary of the media landscape of the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. You have listed film production houses that are referenced in the interviews done with Želimir Žilnik. And also there are some periodicals that he's mentioning in his interviews, which were also important as a platforms on which there was platforms that staged the struggles for kind of cultural debates and even cultural hegemony. And there is an interesting case to see how those media outlets vary from the dailies, right? The dailies and the daily newspapers to weeklies and also very specific academic journals for literature and social theory. And they are all kind of participating there. Those are all platforms. So when you see it, you see the very multi-carpeted media landscape, unlike what is today the case in all these countries. So I found that very interesting. Just, you know, you have like just list of these, but it's very telling.
I appreciate that because that was one of my suggestions that I thought would be an essential part of the translation, that it's not just a language translation, but sort of a way to address a pretty scant knowledge of what the sort of media and cultural world or institutional world of socialist Yugoslavia was like. And since all of these papers and institutions and film houses were mentioned, we sort of put our resources together to figure out how to provide an index of these places. And of course, we could have gone on and added more, but this is limited to the ones that are actually mentioned in the book.
Yeah, I think that's very useful, and it's also telling in terms of how it was different back then, even if we lived without the technology that is available today, social networks and what's not, how it was still very very vivid, very multicolored and rich and diverse. And also how people would engage with all these venues in terms of like writing articles and reading articles, regardless whether they were coming from the field of like artist practice or from some academic field. They were all interconnected and participating in the discourse, which is, you know, when you think about contemporary moment, it stands out in stark difference. And also you in the book you have the timeline, which I was really pleased to see it goes backwards from contemporary moment to the recent, relatively speaking, recent past. So you end or begin your timeline with French Revolution. And now it came to my mind that famous Chinese saying like, oh, we have to wait for 200 years to kind of evaluate what was the revolutionary moment. But yeah, it seems that we are still in that same narrative globally, right? In this narrative of change and narrative of revolution, whether or not we want to admit that. And that is one of the messages of this book, I would say, as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I was sort of very keen on the timeline and the media landscape and the maps, partly in sort of acknowledgement of what I imagine Anglophone audiences might know, especially North America, of the geography of the former country and how close or far it was to anything in the world. But also that sort of looking back in this casting of gazes on various things in the past, it's not an entirely pessimistic or sort of catastrophic look. It's more of a way to bring together the ambivalences about the past and all kinds of emancipatory politics that brought us sort of minority histories and histories of the unrepresented, but also heritage studies and various kinds of glamorizing and glossy ideas of the past. So I appreciate the recognition that there's something kind of something that communicates in these additional materials that are not just the book as a solid text, but a book as an object that also lives in its time and its own conditions. And that reading is a different thing now than it was 10 years ago and in a different language.
Yeah, and I also want to add just, I mean, you probably will have someone talking about that more in more detail, but having these QR codes that bring you to the first edition of the book in original language, I found also very smart, and it's kind of a little bit indiscreet detail, but it is a part of the entire production of this subject, and it connects it. Of course, this first book lives on a website that is called Memory of the World, that features electronic editions or scans of the book that have been published in former Yugoslavia and beyond.
The idea to connect to sort of other sources of knowledge through QR codes or whatever updated technologies that came from people in the Balkans. And it became sort of an interesting thing because for the book in English to be available in the Balkans, all these QR codes have to direct you to a place that's actually accessible. And of course, as we know, part of the sort of global trade in knowledge has it so that many people can't afford to subscribe to databases. Even educational institutions can't afford to subscribe to what to us looks like the basic sort of access to the knowledge market. So all the QR codes have been vetted so that they take you to Memory of the World, which will hold stuff that actually can be read. And historian Emil Kerenyi has helped us to pick the sort of historical literature on the region. So that's also a very significant element of how well put together the book ends up being.
Yeah, and I do think that there is a mission, first of all, to share knowledge in this way, which is wonderful and so important. But also there is a mission for this book to be read and discussed in the region, in the Balkans, as much as this printed beautiful edition has and will have a its own role in education system in North America.
Yeah. To me, one of the sort of interesting things about all the talk of decolonizing this and that when it comes to former Yugoslavia is, I think, only getting to the point where we're talking about the language politics, not as the sort of dominant languages giving themselves names, but that plenty of people who used to live in former Yugoslavia and do get mentioned in this book did not speak that language of hegemony. So English might actually become, for all the ironic power that it has, it might become sort of the lingua franca of former Yugoslavia. It's weird, yet true. I'm glad if it works, and I do really wish for it to be in the hands or in front of the eyes of or in the ears of many people who want to have a way of thinking about what happened in the place and how that can be understood in broader terms and over a longer historical context. Did I not ask anything that you think we should?
Yeah, you did. I think I think as an object, for me, that was an interesting thing to mention. If no one mentioned, maybe,
Yeah.
People should hear about it, that, there are those additions such as media landscape and timeline among the preface that Boris Budin wrote, right?
Yeah, I want to mention the name of the designer. And I can't remember the full name, so I'm trying to look it up, and I will do it in.
Yeah, it says this book was produced by, and then Boris Budin, who wrote the essays and conducted conversations with Želimir Žilnik, Hito Sterl, who recorded conversation between Boris and Želimir. Then, of course, Želimir Žilnik, who answered all these questions orally and in writing. Olivera Jokic, who translated the book into English, re-edited and significantly improved the text. Kuda.org, the book's initiators, who edited, redacted, and coordinated the work of book creation. And then as publishers are listed, as you said, kuda.org, Multimedia Institute, and Iskra Books.
Yeah.
Design and layout is done by Dan Kršić.
Yes, Dan Kršić is the designer.
Who is an important graphic designer for this type of books and this type of language as well.
Yes.
So visually,
and even the font was I didn't intervene on time. I wanted it to be mentioned the way that the font design is mentioned in books published in the UK and the US. But the font itself was designed by someone in Croatia.
Yeah, by Nikola Jurek.
Mhm.
His name is Nikola Jurek. Yes, and it looks very appealing for reading.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
And I love the red moment on the inside cover.
Mhm,
That it's
mhm.
sort of a
Yeah,
refreshing
yeah,
encounter with a book.
yeah. And I'll also say the QR codes are to all the books that are available online, which is,
Mhm.
not just few of them, but some of the books that are referenced in the interviews and writings by Budin are also the books that the
Mhm.
reader could access via the
Mhm.
link.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it took a while, but I think it was worth it. I was very invested in making this thing
Yeah.
appear, this
Yeah, you
creature.
should be proud, and yeah, we'll definitely. I'll take care as much as I can to introduce
Thank you.
this book to my students. So
Thank you.
yeah,
I'm supposed to send some sort of an announcement to several places, but um, I hope quite a few people can know about it and use it
yeah,
and have their libraries order it
yeah.
whenever it's out in the US. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivera, and as I said, congrats, great work.
Thank you. Thank you.